What if the most trusted man on American television was living a double life that would have destroyed him if anyone had dared to speak? Johnny Carson smiled at you every single night for 30 years. He cracked jokes, he charmed presidents, he made you feel like you were sitting in your own living room with your favorite uncle. But that warm, familiar face you welcomed into your home every evening was only half the story. The other half was locked behind doors that almost no one was ever allowed to open. The women, the secrets, the carefully constructed walls between his public self and his private self, all of it stayed buried for decades, not by accident, but by design. A machine was working behind the scenes to make sure of it, and it worked almost perfectly. Almost. So let's pull back that curtain and step into the world Johnny Carson never wanted anyone to see. To understand why Carson's personal life stayed hidden for so long, you have to understand the era he lived in. When Carson first took over The Tonight Show in 1962, America was changing fast. Television had become the center of everything. It wasn't the movies or the radio anymore that shaped how people thought and felt. It was the glowing screen in the living room, and Johnny Carson's voice was the one filling the room every single night. He was smooth, he was witty, and he had this effortless Midwestern charm that made him feel safe. During a time when the country was grappling with the Cold War, civil rights, and the chaos of Vietnam, Carson was the one constant. He was the man who could make you laugh without ever making you uncomfortable. His jokes had an edge, sure, but they were never crude. His style was suave without ever crossing a line. He was in every sense America's late-night friend. But Hollywood in the 60s and 70s operated on an unspoken agreement. Scandals didn't get exposed. They got managed. Affairs, heavy drinking, personal disasters. All of it circulated in whispers among the right people, but it almost never made it into print. This wasn't carelessness. It was a calculated business decision. Stars like Carson were brands. The studios, the networks, the sponsors, they all had a financial stake in keeping those brands clean. Tabloid journalism existed, of course, but it wasn't yet the ruthless, around-the-clock machine it would become in the 80s and 90s. There was no TMZ. There was no social media. Photographers like Ron Galella might lurk outside a restaurant or trail someone through Los Angeles, but editors knew when to kill a story. Publicists knew exactly how to trade access for silence. Frank Sinatra, who was close to Carson, once summed it up perfectly when he told a reporter, "The press is like a pack of dogs. You throw them a bone, they'll leave you alone." And bones were thrown. Carefully planted stories about lesser-known figures, orchestrated narratives designed to redirect attention, anything to keep the real secrets safely out of sight. This system was deeply tangled up with the power structure of the entertainment industry. It was a boys' club in the most literal sense. Powerful men like Carson, Sinatra, and Dean Martin could indulge in affairs, drink too much, and live however they wanted without any real fear of public fallout. Women, on the other hand, were expected to keep quiet or risk being labeled difficult, or worse. Actresses who understood the game learned to play it with precision. They kept their mouths shut. They maintained their composure, and they understood that discretion was the price of being allowed anywhere near the inner circles of fame. The sexual revolution was underway. Books like The Feminine Mystique were reshaping how women thought about themselves, and birth control had changed the landscape of relationships forever. But for someone like Carson, whose audience stretched across Middle America, the balancing act had to be careful. He could hint at being modern enough to stay relevant with younger viewers, but he could never risk alienating the older, more conservative audience that tuned in faithfully every single night. So his on-air persona stayed exactly where it needed to be, a political, non-threatening, and clean-cut. Even the people closest to Carson tended to shield him. Ed McMahon, who spent decades by his side on The Tonight Show, later described Carson as one of the most complicated men he had ever known. Warm and generous one moment, cold and unreachable the next. In his memoir, M.C. Mahonen wrote that Johnny was a deeply private man, and that even those who knew him well understood there were parts of his life he simply did not share. It wasn't until long after the old rules of celebrity began to crack apart that the full picture of Carson's personal life started coming into the light. And when it did, what emerged was a story far more layered than anyone watching The Tonight Show could have imagined. Carson was married 4 times, and each marriage told a different part of the story. His first wife, Joan Merle Wolcott, whom he married in 1949, was a classic post-war union. It made sense at the time, two young people starting a life together, but it couldn't survive the weight of Carson's rising fame and the man he was becoming. By the time they divorced in 1963, Carson had already become a national figure, and the fractures in his personal life had been growing quietly for years without anyone on the outside ever noticing. His second marriage to model Joanne Copeland in 1963 seemed on the surface like a perfect match. Copeland was elegant, poised, and socially sharp, exactly the kind of woman who could stand next to the king of late night without looking out of place. But Carson's brutal work schedule, his emotional distance, and the persistent whispers about his wandering eye made their marriage unsustainable. By 1972, it was over. The third marriage was the one that defined Carson's personal reputation for years. Joanna Holland was a former model and socialite, the kind of woman who could hold her own in the elite social circles Carson moved through. They married on September 30th, 1972, in Santa Monica, and for a while, they projected exactly the image Carson needed. A glamorous, high-society couple living the life that came with being Hollywood royalty. Carson's Malibu home, worth $5 million at the time, became the backdrop for lavish gatherings and an enviable lifestyle. But behind closed doors, the marriage was falling apart. Public arguments, Carson's admitted infidelities, and an emotional distance that only grew wider over time turned what looked like a dream on the outside into something much darker on the inside. When Holland filed for divorce on March 8, 1983, it reportedly caught even Carson off guard. The split was acrimonious, drawn out, and ultimately settled with Holland walking away with a $20 million settlement. Years later, Holland would describe Carson as a man who could never truly be known, a statement that carried the weight of someone who had tried and failed to get behind the walls. Carson's fourth and final marriage to Alexis Maz in 1987 was strikingly different from everything that came before. Maz was younger, less connected to the Hollywood machine, and worked in stock brokerage before they met. Their relationship was quieter, more private, and lasted until Carson's death in 2005. Some saw it as the quieter chapter Carson needed after decades of turbulence. By then, he had stepped back from the spotlight entirely, and the glitz of his earlier life had faded into memory. But even with 4 marriages on the record, the official story was only the beginning. The whispers about Angie Dickinson and Johnny Carson have persisted for decades, and they refuse to go away no matter how much time passes. By the late 60s and early 70s, Dickinson was one of the most compelling presences in Hollywood. Her role as Feather, opposite John Wayne in Rio Bravo, had made her a sex symbol, but it was Policewoman, where she played the sharp, street-smart Sergeant Pepper Anderson, that turned her into a household name. She wasn't just beautiful. She was a symbol of something shifting in American culture, a woman who could project both power and sensuality at the same time. Carson, meanwhile, was at the absolute height of his fame. The Tonight Show was pulling in over 15 million viewers a night, and he was the undisputed ruler of late-night television. He was also, by the mid-70s, a man who had been married 3 times and was known within the industry for his volatile temper and his deep attraction to beautiful, confident women. The alleged connection between Carson and Dickinson never made it into print in any definitive way, but the timeline lines up in ways that insiders found difficult to ignore. Dickinson's career was surging thanks to Policewoman, which premiered in 1974, while Carson was navigating the rocky early years of his marriage to Joanna Holland. Multiple sources, speaking off the record over the years, described private gatherings at places like the Beverly Hills Hotel and intimate dinner at La Scala, where Carson and Dickinson were spotted together in dimly lit corners, their chemistry unmistakable to anyone paying attention. A studio technician who worked on The Tonight Show during that period later spoke anonymously about seeing Dickinson slip into Carson's dressing room more than once after tapings, always leaving quietly, always without any fuss. They had an understanding, he said. It wasn't something they put on display, but the chemistry was real. You could feel it. Dickinson herself never confirmed or denied the affair directly, but her comments over the years left the door wide open. In a 2003 interview with Larry King, when asked about Carson, she smiled and called him a wonderful man. Very charming, very fun. The way she said fun, with a pause, before the word that lasted just a beat too long, raised eyebrows in the room. In a 2007 Vanity Fair feature, she spoke about her past relationships in terms of wonderful memories with wonderful men, declining to name anyone but leaving the interpretation entirely up to her audience. It was a classic move: never deny, never confirm, and let the mystery do the work. For Carson, the appeal of someone like Dickinson was obvious. She was intelligent, self-assured, and completely in control of her own image, exactly the kind of woman who could both captivate and challenge him. But the risk was just as real. Carson's entire brand depended on maintaining a certain kind of universal, unthreatening appeal, and any whiff of scandal could have cracked that carefully built foundation. Marilyn Chambers arrived on the national stage like a detonation. She had been the wholesome, fresh-faced model on Ivory Snow detergent boxes 99 and 44 100% pure, the tagline read, and then in 1972 she starred in Behind the Green Door, a full-length adult film that became a cultural earthquake. The shock wasn't just about what was in the movie. It was about her. The same woman who had cradled a baby in a laundry detergent commercial was now at the center of one of the most talked-about films in the country. Along with Linda Lovelace, Chambers became a lightning rod in the national conversation about sexual liberation, pornography, and the boundaries of what mainstream America was willing to accept. It was somewhere in the middle of all that cultural chaos that rumors began circulating about a brief, quiet connection between Chambers and Carson. The alleged fling is said to have taken place sometime between 1972 and 1974, during a period when Chambers' fame was exploding and Carson was dealing with the collapse of his second marriage. A former Tonight Show staffer, speaking anonymously years later, described the situation as casual, a few private. Meetings, some drinks, some conversation, nothing that was meant to last or go anywhere. Carson, the source said, understood the situation perfectly. Chambers was too hot a story. Associating with her publicly would have been catastrophic for everything he had built. So if anything happened, it happened quietly. In Carson's dressing room after tappings, at invitation-only gatherings in the Hollywood Hills where the music was loud and the press was nowhere near. In the kinds of private spaces where the rules of the outside world simply did not apply. Chambers herself, in later years, spoke candidly about the men who crossed her path during that wild period, though she never named Carson specifically. In a 2003 interview, she reflected on the paradox of her own fame, describing herself as the girl next door who was also the girl nobody wanted to mention at dinner parties. She spoke about high-profile men who had reached out to her during those years, noting that they wanted the fantasy, but had no desire for the world to know about it. Those words could have been written about Carson himself, a man fascinated by the energy and raw boldness Chambers represented, but absolutely unwilling to let that world touch his public image. Morgan Fairchild was everything Carson's world seemed drawn to. Glamorous, blonde, ambitious, and sharp enough to navigate the treacherous social landscape of Hollywood without stumbling. She first made a name for herself on the soap opera Search for Tomorrow, playing the scheming Jennifer Pace, and later took on the iconic role of Jenna Wade on Dallas. Her rise coincided directly with Carson's reign, and as she began appearing on The Tonight Show more frequently and showing up at the same list events where Carson held court, the whisper started. Those who were around Carson during that period later suggested that something shifted in his demeanor whenever Fairchild was in the room. A Tonight Show staffer from the mid-70s recalled, noticing how Carson would become more attentive, more animated, a twinkle in his eye that went beyond the usual professional courtesy. Comedian David Brunner, who moved in the same circles, once joked in private company that Carson had a particular weakness for glamorous blondes who could hold their own at the table. Fairchild never publicly addressed the rumors in any direct way, but she has spoken over the years about the realities of being a young woman navigating Hollywood's male-dominated culture. In a 1995 interview with People, she spoke about learning how to handle attention, how to deflect what she didn't want, and how to stay in the game. For Carson, a connection with Fairchild, whether it was a full affair or simply a flirtation that never fully materialized, would have fit the pattern of his life during that decade. He was married to Joanna Holland, but their relationship was strained in ways that insiders understood even if the public did not. Carson's charm and his position at the center of television made him magnetic to ambitious, beautiful women, and Fairchild, who understood the value of proximity to power, might well have found the attention flattering, even if it stayed quiet and short-lived. Adrienne LaRussa occupies a quieter corner of this story, but she is no less significant. In the early 70s, she was a familiar presence on television dramas and soap operas, with striking features, high cheekbones, expressive eyes, and an understated allure that made her a regular at Hollywood's social gatherings. The rumored encounter with Carson is said to have taken place around 1973, likely at one of the private industry gatherings held at the Beverly Hills Hotel, a place Carson frequented after tapings. An anonymous Tonight Show staffer who later spoke to a biographer described seeing LaRussa coming and going at odd hours, sometimes late at night, sometimes early in the morning, and noted that she was always careful never to be seen, leaving directly with Carson. But people noticed, the source added. LaRussa has never publicly commented on any of this, and no photographs, confirmed accounts, have ever surfaced to make the speculation concrete. But the whispers persisted, because they fit so neatly into the larger pattern of Carson's private life. That pattern is worth examining on its own. One of the most striking things about Carson's romantic history, whether confirmed or rumored, was the imbalance of power at its center. Carson wasn't just a man with a wandering eye. He was the gatekeeper of late-night television. A single appearance on The Tonight Show could launch a career. A single snub could quietly end one. For young women in Hollywood, getting close to Carson was both an opportunity and a trap. And Carson, whether consciously or not, seemed drawn to women who were not yet powerful enough to challenge him, women who would stay discreet, who wouldn't rock the boat, and who, if things went sideways, wouldn't have the platform or the courage to speak out. There were whispers about lesser-known actresses like Elaine Joyce and Susan Anton, both of whom had the particular combination of beauty and ambition that seemed to catch Carson's attention. Joyce, known for her work on game shows and sitcoms, was considered by some insiders to have been a favorite of Carson's for a brief stretch. Anton, who gained fame in the mid-70s through film roles and modeling, was rumored to have had at least a flirtatious connection with him during her early rise. The culture of the time made all of this possible in ways that are difficult to fully appreciate from the outside. The entertainment industry was a closed system, a world where powerful men looked out for each other and where the unspoken rule was simple. What happened behind closed doors stayed there. Women who might have spoken out risked not just their own reputations, but their entire careers in an industry where men like Carson controlled who got work and who didn't. Carson's marriages reflected his broader struggles. Joanne Copeland endured years of neglect and emotional distance before their divorce. His marriage to Joanna Holland, which lasted over a decade, was marked by long stretches of coldness and sudden outbursts that kept even those close to him on edge. Carson's friend, comedian Dick Cavett, once said in a private conversation that Johnny could charm an audience of millions but struggled to simply sit in a room with one person. He wanted love, Cavett said, but he didn't know how to give it back. Carson's immense power shielded him from consequences in ways that most people never fully understood. His careful control over his private life, combined with the conservative public morality of the era and the absence of invasive paparazzi culture, allowed him to maintain his image as America's charming, wholesome late-night host, even as he quietly lived a personal life that bore almost no resemblance to the man on screen. It wasn't until after his death in 2005, in a media landscape that had become far more aggressive and far less forgiving, that many of these stories began to surface. What they revealed was not simply a man with a complicated love life, but a figure whose public persona and private reality were so carefully separated that even the people closest to him could never say with certainty that they truly knew him. Johnny Carson built walls around himself that were almost impenetrable, But now, decades later, the stories are finally coming through, one quiet whisper at a time.